All right, good morning or afternoon. I never know what to say. History and geography. And we are going to look at page 240 today. We're actually going to finish the chapter today, page 240. And then we will have an assignment after that, not today, but for tomorrow, Friday, we're having our Zoom class. And probably Monday, we will have an open book test. Okay, so keep that in mind. But section 13.4 is where we're going to be today. And we're going to start with talking about dreaming of peace. Now, everyone loves peace. Who likes fighting? I know if we were in class, one of you boys would have raised your hand. I do. But nobody really likes fighting. No one likes war. Okay? No one wants to see people die. No one does. I don't, you don't, no one does. And Woodrow Wilson had a dream of the League of Nations, and remember, it failed. It did not work. So there were people, along with Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who had been president, that believe we need to form an organization similar, but give them a few more powers than the League of Nations had. And they formed an organization called the United Nations. In 1945, they met in San Francisco for the first time. This is right after World War II. And 50 nations, representatives from 50 nations, each country would send some representatives. They met in San Francisco, and they formed the United Nations. Later, they would move to New York City, and you'll see a picture of the building in New York. Now, this was based on scientific humanism, or the science of humanism. And FDR said this. He said, and this is in your book, bottom of 240, we must cultivate the science of human relations, the ability of all people of all kinds to live together and work together in the same world at peace. Listen, if you are using the science of human relations to bring about peace, it's failed from the get-go. The only thing that brings peace is God, and we know that. We see that in Scripture. God brings true peace. Science and humanism can't do it. And so the United Nations from the get-go was operating under a false premise. There's a shadow there. See that? Whoop, whoop. Anyway, okay, so since the United Nations took over, this shows how well they've done. Over 1 billion people have been slaves under communism. 40 million people have been executed by communists. There have been at least 100 wars fought around the world. As you can see, the United Nations has not had that much of an effect. Now, have we had a big world war? No. But who knows if we'd have one anyway. But the United Nations really not the solution. And they are weak organization that, in my opinion, in your teacher's opinion, does not do much at all. But wanted to mention it because it is in the book. One of the things that happened after World War II, we defeated Nazism, we defeated fascism, we defeated the militarism in Japan. And if you'll recall, the only reason the Soviet Union was fighting with the Allies is because Germany attacked them. And who knows, they may have opted, in fact, they had worked a treaty out with Italy to not fight in the war. And if Germany hadn't attacked the Soviet Union, who knows what would have happened. But one of the things I think the Soviet Union joined the Allies for is they knew that the Allies would win. And after it was over, they were going to split up the property, and these governments of these small countries that have been taken over would need rebuilding. And they thought, well, hey, we'll help rebuild them communist style. And that's exactly what happened after World War II. China was one of the first to fall to communism. Now, Chiang Kai-shek was a Christian man. He was a good man, one of the great heroes of the 20th century, as your book says. And they had fought off the Japanese in China, had done a good job of doing that, but they were, after that, after you fought the Japanese for a long time, you're weakened. Okay, you've lost some people, you've lost a lot of your military supplies, those type of things. Well, the Soviet Union gave Chinese communists large amounts of ammunition, large amounts of tanks and weapons and supplies. And these Chinese communists seek to take over. And one of the sad things in history, Chiang Kai shek has to leave. And he and members of his free government go to what is known as Taiwan. They called it the Republic of China. Even to this day, I saw something on the news last night. China will not recognize Taiwan. They just won't do it because that is where their former government went, and they were free. And a guy by the name of Mao Zedong took over. And he killed, understand, at least 800,000 opponents of communism. Nearly 1 million people. Terrible. Terrible. Mao Zedong, one of the worst people, one of the worst human beings that has ever lived, to be honest. And here's the thing, Taiwan did well. They set up businesses. They set up all kinds of capitalist things, and they did well. But China, after they fell to communism, the people were poor. We see all the problems that China even has to this day. A lot of problems in China. Communism does not work. Communism, as we've talked about, is where the government owns everything. You have no rights. You have no religion. And communism does not work. China suffered as a result. One of the other places that fell to communism was East Germany. Now, here's the way it works, and I wish I had a blackboard. I could. I'm just going to... This is Germany before the war. Okay? And after the war, they split Germany in two parts. I mean, they didn't do that, but they drew a line down the middle. East Germany and West Germany. Well, there was a city in East Germany called Berlin. And Berlin was in the heart of communist territory. But part of the city was free-owned, capitalist, free society. The other half of Berlin, it made no sense to divide it this way, but that's the way they did it. The other half was communist. And here's the problem. If I'm living across, my neighbor across the street, there's the outside wall, and I've got a neighbor across the street. If I'm living in a communist area, there's oppression, there's no food, things are bad, the economy is awful, people are holding guns on me, or, not right on me, but, people are patrolling all around with guns and making sure I'm not doing anything they don't like. And across the street, everything's free. And the economy's good. The economy's booming. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to go live over there. Live with my neighbor. That's what happened in Berlin. People in East Berlin were going out by the gobs to get to West Berlin because there was communism in East Berlin, to the point that they built a wall to keep people out. President Kennedy said about the wall in Berlin that what better way to show the world how bad communism is. The people at the time in the U.S. government said, hey, we need to do something about this. Do we need to attack? They're building a wall in Berlin. He's like, no, what better way to show the world how bad communism is that you have to build a wall to keep people in or they'll leave. It's been called the Wall of Shame. Now, later on, it was torn down in 1989, and the reason it was is because of some of President Reagan's policies, and hopefully we'll have an opportunity to get into that before the school year is over. Okay, page 242. 242. Let's look at that real quick. A couple of other things. One of them was, we talked about the Holocaust and how persecuted the Jews were. A lot of Jews were killed during World War II. A lot of them were persecuted. And they were all over the world. They had scattered, and people around the world recognized, hey, maybe the Jews need a permanent home in Palestine. Now, the Bible had said this would happen years before, but in 1948, Israel once again became a nation. And it was basically overnight. They set up a nation in 1948. They built factories and schools and towns, and it is a thriving nation. It's the most advanced country in the Middle East today. It's still there. The sad thing about Israel, where it's located, all around them are enemies. And everybody in that area, all the Muslims, all the Islamic people, they hate Israel. But Israel still stands. The reason it still stands is because God is for them. As I said, they're the most advanced country in the Middle East. Another thing that happened, real quick, this is going to be another war, the Korean War. Korea, you'll see a picture of it on page 242. It is a peninsula south of Manchuria. And you'll see it's divided North and South Korea. Now, what happened is the Russians set up a communist government in North Korea. And South Korea had a free government. Things were going well in South Korea, not so well in North Korea. But the communists never are satisfied with what they have, and they wanted to attack South Korea. And they did. In 1950, communist North Korea invaded South Korea, and the UN, who we mentioned earlier, the United Nations, they sent troops. Now, 15 nations were represented in these troops, but the United States made up the majority of it. Now, here's the thing. We talked about General Douglas MacArthur yesterday. And MacArthur, when he went to fight with the UN troops, the communists had basically taken over all of South Korea. But in 1950, MacArthur got all of his military might. He did some great maneuvers, and he drove the communists out of South Korea, and he even went into North Korea to invade. And the Chinese jumped in at this point. We've had just communist North Koreans at this point. The Chinese jump in at this point. And MacArthur asked President Truman, who had taken over after FDR died near the end of World War II. In fact, Truman is the one who gave the okay to drop the atomic bomb. MacArthur goes to President Truman and says, hey, why don't we invade China? Let's wipe out communism in that area altogether. We'll free North Korea. We'll free China. We'll get rid of all of it in this area. But President Truman believed in containment. Let's keep them contained. We'll give them what they've got, but we won't let them have any more. And General MacArthur had the quote, there is no substitute for victory. He thought that containment was a weak option. It was not a very strong option at all. So, political factions in Washington, D.C. decided, because MacArthur disagreed with President Truman, it's time to bring MacArthur back home. And that's where we talked about the hero's welcome and one of the great American heroes of all time. So MacArthur leaves, and guess what? The United States withdrew from North Korea in 1953, and they let the communists keep North Korea. This idea of containment. Okay? And as a result, there's a cruel dictatorship in North Korea to this day. You've heard of Kim Jong-un. He is in charge, and his father, Kim Jong-il, and before him, all the Kims were in charge of Korea, and it's abysmal. They say, and I've seen pictures, I hope they're legit, that if you fly over the Korean peninsula at night, this shows you the difference, once again, between capitalism, freedom, and communism. If you fly over South Korea, the free part of the peninsula, the free country, at night, there's all kinds of lights, all kinds of traffic lights and street lights and building lights, house lights. If you fly over North Korea, you'll be lucky to see a light bulb on, because they're poor, because they don't have anything. And who gets it all? The leader, Kim Jong-un. It's communism does not work, and communism started to spread after World War II, and the Soviet Union tried to take a lot of these little countries over that Germany had occupied, that Italy had occupied, and they made them communist states. And the United States was weak on a lot of it with this policy of containment, and as a result, there are communist nations to this day that are still in effect because of what we did. Tomorrow, you will have an assignment. Today, read over those materials, mark done in the comments, D-O-N-E, And you're done for today. But make sure you read it. Make sure you've watched the video, which hopefully you've had to watch to this point to hear what you were supposed to do. Listen, love y'all. Praying for you. I know I say that a bunch, but I honestly mean it. I love y'all. Miss y'all. Praying for you. And tomorrow you'll have an assignment. Friday, we're going to do a little Zooming, and we'll meet as a class. We'll talk to you later.